How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
The work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.
Good morning. Our first item of business today is general questions. Our first question from Alasdair, Allan.
To ask the Scottish Government how many people are employed by the Crofting Commission.
Cabinet Secretary Fergus Ewing.
Presiding Officer, the Crofting Commission currently has a staff of 55. None of these are employed directly by the Commission. 2 are temporary staff provided by an agency, and all the others are Scottish Government staff on secondment.
Alasdair, Allan.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Despite my constituency having more than a third of all crofts in Scotland, the Crofting Commission can often seem a long way away. What consideration can the Scottish Government give to relocating any jobs or moving any vacant posts from the Crofting Commission to the Western Isles, where they could perhaps be closer to the crofting communities that they serve?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, Dr Allan has been raising this with me for some time on behalf of his constituents. As a result, I agree that this should be considered and have already had preliminary discussions with officials. I've asked officials to explore this further with the Crofting Commission and its board, and I will discuss this with the board when I meet with them later in the year. I'm always looking for ways to strengthen the links between the Crofting Commission and the communities it serves.
Thank you. Question number 2, Annabelle Ewing.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it plans to review exemptions under the plastic bag charging scheme.
Cabinet Secretary Rosanna Cunningham.
We have no plans to review the exemptions under the Single-Use Carrier Bags Charge Scotland Regulations 2014. Our approach to exemptions was carefully considered and based on experience in other countries. Our recent consultation on proposals for legislation on the circular economy, which included a question on increasing the carrier bag charge, raised no issues, as far as I'm aware, on the question of exemptions and a change to the policy.
Annabelle Ewing.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her answer on the important issue, though, of the scope of the exemption regime. She will be aware that the current 2014 plastic bag exemptions include prescription medicines. Some, like plastic-free Dalgety Bay, question why that should still be the case. Given that the Welsh Government is reportedly looking at this exemption again, will the Cabinet Secretary consider now reviewing this particular exemption to the plastic bag charging scheme in Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the single-use carrier bags charge applies to both plastic and paper bags. The exemption for prescription medicines in the regulations was asked for by pharmacists to protect the privacy of people collecting medicines, and that confidentiality remains important. We will, however, of course, monitor any developments in the policy in Wales, and I am glad to see that many pharmacies are already using paper bags when dispensing medicines and appliances, and I'd encourage other pharmacies to follow that lead.
Question number 3, Shona Robison.
To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the announcement that Police Scotland is developing proposals to trial the use of a life-saving nasal spray that allows officers to treat victims of a drugs overdose.
Cabinet Secretary Hamza Youssef.
I very much welcome the news that Police Scotland is conducting this test of change. We know that naloxone can help save lives, and as such, improving the provision of naloxone, particularly amongst emergency responders, has been a key focus of the early work of the Drugs Death Task Force. We're now seeing the results of this from other sectors, and news of this development follows on from the recent announcement made by the Scottish Ambulance Service to pilot a trial of naloxone. When the test for change being run by Police Scotland concludes, it will be for the Force Executive to assess the test and decide on the next key steps. Of course, as the member would expect, feedback from officers on the ground will undoubtedly be a key part of that assessment.
Shona Robison.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response? Yesterday I attended the Drug Death Summit in Glasgow and was encouraged by the determination shown to tackle this issue on many fronts, including the role played by Police Scotland. So can the Cabinet Secretary expand on how he sees the role of Police Scotland developing in the crucial work to reduce drug deaths in Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for what is an exceptionally important question. So the test for change for officers to carry naloxone, we'll continue to see how that develops. I think we'll be keeping a close eye on what could be a potentially really important development. What I would also say to the member, which is incredibly important, is as well as the enforcement aspect of the work that Police Scotland do, which of course is incredibly important to disrupt serious organised crime gangs, who of course are supplying drugs into our communities. The reducing harm aspect of what Police Scotland is doing is hugely important. And there are examples right up and down the country, I suspect, in the member's own constituency, where police are working with multi-agency partners to ensure that they are reducing the harm caused by illicit drugs in our community. So there is, of course, the enforcement aspect, but equally police work with other partners to reduce the harm, and I think that's exceptionally important. They continue to do that work.
Thank you. Question number 4 has been withdrawn. Question 5, Margaret Mitchell.
To ask the Scottish Government what it is doing to support voluntary and third sector organisations.
Cabinet Secretary Aileen Campbell.
Thank you. The Scottish Government draft budget includes investment of £24.6 million for the third sector in 2020-21. This will enable us to continue to work in partnership to deliver on Scotland's National Performance Framework. The third sector budget represents just one aspect of overall spend to the third sector from across Scottish Government portfolios. For example, the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations has estimated that in 2018 the income to the third sector from the Scottish Government was £472 million, which represents 7.9% of total income. The third sector is not only a crucial part of our social and economic infrastructure, but has a key role to play in the reform of our public services. Without them, we would not be able to innovate, adapt and maintain our drive to tackle deep-rooted social challenges in the way that we are.
Margaret Mitchell.
I thank the Minister for that reply. Given the involvement and reliance on the voluntary and third sector, especially in criminal justice work, does the Minister agree that Apex Scotland with the Apex Scotland, the annual budget process for justice-related third sector organisations is extremely wasteful and inefficient, and that as a priority it should be replaced with, at the very least, a more sustainable and effective minimum 3-year funding, which would encourage preventative spend.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think everyone agrees that an ideal situation would be to be able to provide three-year budgets and indicate that length of commitment to organisations that do and continue to do great work in the way that the third sector are so rightly credited for. However, it doesn't help when we do have a yearly budget, and it doesn't help when that budget has been delayed. And indeed, that has been a big plea from the third sector, has been the uncertainty over the delay to this UK budget. And not only that, but no clarity as yet over the Shared Prosperity Fund, continued austerity, continually having to mop up the pieces from the UK government. But again, on the point of principle, that is something we're always willing to agree with, work with other parties on. But the fundamental challenge is that when we only get one-year budget, that has a knock-on impact to the programmes and the operations that we try to fund. But we'll continue to engage with Margaret Mitchell, but I would say the delay to the UK budget has been one of the big things that the third sector has raised with me as a particular point of concern.
And Claire Baker.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And this morning I received an email from Kingdom Off-Road Motorcycle Club, and I understand the transitioning between the Community Jobs Scotland programme into the No One Left Behind model, which is due to start in April 2021. This appears to be creating a funding gap, and I understand that grants of offers have been withdrawn. Could the Cabinet Secretary investigate this?
Cabinet Secretary.
Happily meet with Claire Baker. In the answer I gave to Margaret Mitchell, I did note that the third sector budget, which sits in my portfolio, is only a small part of the overall funding that comes from government. Indeed, it was SCVO that noted that there was the third sector income was benefited by £472 million across different portfolios. So again, I will endeavour to meet with Claire Baker to talk about this one, because it could sit in another part of government, so that we get that clarity that she needs and the organisation needs, and the support that they may require.
Thank you. Question number 6, Alison Harris.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government how it measures the outcomes of city and regional growth deals.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
Deals are three-way partnerships between the Scottish Government, the UK Government and regional partners. It is incumbent on all partners to demonstrate impact through appropriate monitoring and evaluation arrangements. Deals are long-term investments delivered over 10 years or more, and outcomes will take some time to develop, but we can already see returns for our economy and for our communities. For example, our investment in the Glasgow City Region deal is transforming at Sight Hill, one of our most deprived areas, for the benefit of future generations.
Alison Harris.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer. A recent report by Audit Scotland stated that the Scottish Government needs to be clearer about what it wants from city regional deals, particularly on how success is measured and the sustainability of economic growth. I appreciate that the majority of city and regional growth deals are underway, but can the Cabinet Secretary commit that for future long-term infrastructure projects, these measures will be in place from the outset?
Cabinet Secretary.
We welcome the report from Audit Scotland, which made a number of recommendations for regional partners and also for the Scottish Government. Disappointingly, it didn't look at the UK Government element of these deals because it doesn't sit within its remit. However, it broadly also applies to the UK Government as well, which is why we have set out that the Scottish Government's Inclusive Growth Outcome Framework, which was refreshed in December 2019, will assist the Scottish Government element of it to be better assessed and to demonstrate the impact which it's having and to support regional partners in doing so. As yet, it's not clear what the UK Government will do in order to make sure that we've got greater sight of the impact that their investment is making through city and city growth deals.
Thank you. Question 7 has not been lodged. Question 8, Claire Baker.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to address antisocial behaviour on quad bikes and similar off-road vehicles.
Minister Ashton.
I am strongly committed to tackling all forms of antisocial behaviour, and was pleased to hear from Police Scotland about the success that the Improving Leaving Mouth Together project has had in tackling the antisocial use of motorcycles. There are, of course, a range of legislative powers available to tackle antisocial behaviour, and successful reductions in antisocial behaviour will be best achieved through this type of effective partnership working. While the Scottish Government remains committed to ensuring that police and local authorities have powers available to them that are effective and fit for purpose, I have asked my officials to consider whether this initiative could be highlighted as an example of best practice which could be adopted in other areas which are experiencing similar problems.
Claire Baker.
Presiding Officer, this is an issue I've been raising for a number of years, but still last week a constituent contacted me to describe a near miss between his family and a quad bike user in a public park. In relation to the letter I received from the Minister in October, can she say more about if any progress or what progress has been made in scoping a national strategy so it's clear to retailers and users of off-road vehicles that it's against the law to use these vehicles in public spaces, that it creates a danger to the safety of members of the public, and that it's antisocial behaviour that will not be tolerated?
Minister.
I am sorry to hear that there has been a problem in parks in Fife, especially as these are places where young children should be able to play in what should be safe surroundings for them without any fear of traffic. I haven't received any information on this, but I would suggest that the lessons learned, the good practice collected through the Improving Leave and Mouth Together project should be shared with those areas in Fife which are experiencing problems.
And Rachel Hamilton.
Officer, antisocial behaviour through reckless illegal driving over farmland is just part of a wider rural crime issue. The rural crime rate is rising and the issue of antisocial motocross, bike theft, machinery damage and rural fuel theft are damaging those communities. The National Rural Crime Network 2018 survey stated that 27% of those living in rural communities felt that reporting was not being dealt with sufficiently. Will the Minister act on calls from rural organisations such as the Countryside Alliance to level up rural funding in those areas where tackling crime, rural crime is difficult, and work with Police Scotland to further develop their Spark programme?
Minister.
I would be happy to meet with the member to discuss some elements of that, because I think some elements of our question may have strayed into a colleague's portfolio. But the Scottish Government fully supports the police, our local authorities and court services to take appropriate and proportionate action to tackle antisocial behaviour. And we believe that the range of powers already available to authorities allow them to deal effectively with antisocial behaviour, regardless of the circumstances that they appear in. However, we are always open to listening to those authorities and indeed to members if they have suggestions on how we can improve this approach in our approach taken to tackle antisocial behaviour to the benefit of all of our communities.
Thank you. Question number 9, Neil Bibby.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to improve transport links in West Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
The Scottish Government is investing in a range of transport improvements in the west of Scotland. This includes the opening of the £30 million A737 Dalry bypass, £5 million Den realignment and continued design work for schemes at Beath and on the A82. Alongside the £350,000 on new active travel measures in Inverclyde and North Ayrshire and the £2.5 million on extending the life of the Gourock Ferry terminal link span to improve resilience for those who use the services from Bute and Arn ferries. We're also refurbishing the regional rail fleet as part of a £475 million national programme. Looking forward, the Strategic Transport Projects Review is considering future investment priorities for the Strategic Transport Network.
Neil Bibby.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. My constituents have consistently raised concerns about ScotRail services. This week, transport statistics confirm that since the so-called world-leading deal with Abellio, passenger satisfaction with ScotRail has fallen across the board. Does the Minister agree that listening to passengers as well as the workers is key to driving improvements in my region and elsewhere? Will he therefore consider the issue of passenger and trade union representation in a future publicly owned ScotRail? And will he also consider how automatic compensation could be introduced to improve service standards for passengers?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the member raises a number of important points. However, he'll be aware of the recent statistics that were published on passenger satisfaction with ScotRail, which showed a marked improvement over the course of the last year, with further work to be undertaken. In some cases, it was the largest increase of any rail operator in the UK in providing regional passenger services. But there's clearly more to be done. In relation to the member's wider point around public ownership of our railways, I very much hope that the Labour Party's position now is to support the full devolution of all rail powers to this Parliament in order to allow us to be able to take that option. To date, they have refused to back that, and I hope we're now getting a commitment for them to give this Parliament the power to make the changes which are necessary to deliver on that priority.
Question number 10, Colin Beattie. Colin Beattie.
To ask the Scottish Government what is being done to find a long-term solution to the pollution issue in the River Esk in the Midlothian North and Musselburgh constituency.
Cabinet Secretary Rosanna.
I am, of course, aware of the recent pollution incident in the River Esk. Scottish Water is committed to cleaning up any sewage-related debris arising from any discharges in storm conditions. In addition, Scottish Water is making regular checks along the River Esk for any signs of sewer debris and is actively working to encourage people to stop flushing the wrong items. In order to minimise the risk from rural diffuse pollution to water quality on the North and South Esk, SEPA has committed to visiting farms in the catchment during 2020 and working with land managers to help reduce pollution.
Colin Beattie.
Does the Cabinet Secretary think it's acceptable to allow sewage to flow into local bodies of water, given that there are 17 sewage outflows along the River Esk within my constituency? And will she take action to encourage SEPA to reduce the sewage going into rivers and streams through outfall pipes?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, operation of the sewer network is a matter for Scottish Water. As the member will be aware, discharges from outfalls generally occur during extreme storm conditions, not during regular operation, and Scottish Water has committed to investigate any recurring network issues. As I indicated in my earlier answer, SEPA does intend to visit farms in the catchment and work with land managers in respect of the diffuse pollution that may emanate from land use.
Thank you very much. That concludes general questions. We're going to turn now to First Minister questions. It's a minute early, but I hope members are happy with that. So first question, Jackson Carlow.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, last summer, exam results showed the higher pass rate had dropped for the 4th year in a row. At the time, John Swinney said these are a strong set of results. Is that still the Government's official position?
First Minister.
Yes, it is. 3/4 of young people passed higher exams. I think that is a good performance. As I have said previously, of course, while exam result performance will fluctuate from year to year, it is important that the Scottish Government assesses the underlying reasons behind that, and that's what we have done here. But as I've also said repeatedly in this chamber, while you have year-on-year fluctuations, the long-term trend in Scottish education and in exam passes in particular is one of improvement. So whether we're looking at passes at level 5, or performance at level 6, which is higher, we see more young people leaving school with these qualifications now than was the case when this government took office, and we will continue to press ahead with exactly those improvements.
Jackson Carlow.
Well, after 13 tricksy years in power, that answer is certainly brave, especially when you consider the contents of the report of the Deputy First Minister commissioned into Scotland's education crisis, slipped out under cover of darkness at the end of last week. In public, praising supposedly strong results, but in private, interested in a detailed analysis of the reported reduction in the A to C rate at higher. In other words, he was alarmed, as were we all, at the plummeting standards in Scotland's schools. But it gets worse. The most recent drop in higher pass rates was mostly due to falls in crucial subjects like English, maths and history, which just a few weeks ago, the First Minister asserted to me were improving. So I ask the First Minister again, is it still her position that the falling exam pass rates represent a strong set of results?
First Minister.
If Jackson Carlow thinks 8 p.m. On a Thursday evening is late, that probably says more about his work rate than it does about anything to do with this Scottish Government. On the issue of John Swinney's candour, can I refer Jackson Carlow to the press release that was issued by the Deputy First Minister on the 6th of August last year, the day the exam results were published, where he says that there has been a fall in the overall pass rate. I don't think that was hiding things, that was being open and transparent. But let's get back to the core issue here of the trend of improvement. Now, Jackson Carlow called my answer brave. I would proffer that the answer actually was accurate. So let's look step by step. Level 5 qualifications. In 06-07, when this government took office, 71.1% of young people left school with a level 5 qualification. In the figures published this week for 18-19, that was 85.1%. Let's look at higher performance. In 06-07, the percentage of young people leaving school with a higher was 41.6%. In the most recent statistics for 2018-19, that was 60.5%. And as I've said many times in the past, we also have more young people leaving now with at least 5 passes at higher. So this government will never shy away from the improvements that need to be made. But if he doesn't want to take my word for the improvements and the strength of Scottish education, perhaps he should pay attention to what, for example, the President of the Association of Directors of Education says. She talks about significant improvement, progress rather, in recent years, or the international experts that advise this government talking about how impressed they are by the efforts of the government to target inequity and inequality. And in the words of one of them last week, the Scottish education system is doing everything we would expect a high-performing system to do. That is the reality, and we will continue to press forward with those improvements.
Well, it's taken a long time, but she has finally followed the habit of her predecessor in patting herself regularly on the back for a performance that everybody else understands is very far from the success she paints it as being. She didn't quote Professor Lindsay Patterson, I note. It's always the selective quotes of people who will cheerlead for her own argument. But it gets worse. Well, I haven't quoted anybody, but it gets worse. Just this month, Mr Swinney told Parliament that the Scottish Government had embarked on reform that was closing the attainment gap and raising standards. However, his own report states exactly the opposite. It says very clearly candidates who are lower attaining are not improving at the same rate as higher attaining young people. So again in public saying everything's fine, the gap is closing, as the First Minister just did, nothing to see here, when in private, months before, his own civil servants have told him something categorically different. Does the First Minister really think that her government has been open and transparent with pupils, parents and the public?
First Minister.
I'm not patting myself or the Deputy First Minister on the back, I'm patting on the back the young people of Scotland who are delivering improvements. I know Jackson Carlaw wants to talk down the Scottish education system, but he should not be allowed to do so. He talks about the attainment gap. Let's look at figures published just this week on Tuesday. The gap between those from the most and least deprived communities in a positive destination is now at a record low. It's less than half what it used to be. And we go back to the hard facts of this matter. There are more young people leaving school now with qualifications than was the case when this government took office. So despite the best efforts of Jackson Carlaw to berate the achievements of Scottish young people, we will continue to support them, their parents and their teachers, and we will continue to drive forward these improvements in our classrooms.
Jackson Carlaw.
Pupils, parents and teachers are not patting the First Minister on the back for her performance. And really, all this cumulative denial no longer will wash, because it's not only has the Cabinet Secretary commissioned a report into a problem he said didn't exist, not only did it contradict what it said, he then refused to publish it, until finally it was brought out on a Thursday night when the government knew they could not be held to account in this chamber for yet a further evidence of their failure in government. He obviously hoped no one would notice. And then, when he finally faced the music, he actually had the audacity to say with a straight face to the media, it takes time to improve an education system. First Minister, time's up. You've had 13 long years in power, 13 years of failure. How much longer do you and this dreadful government need?
First Minister.
Annie Wells comes to mind when I look across at Jackson Carlaw. He's clearly angry that people keep voting for the SNP in elections. Let's come back to it. It's interesting, isn't it, Presiding Officer, that Jackson Carlaw hasn't been able to argue with any of the statistics I've given him today, because those statistics of improvement in our education system are true. So we come back to this nonsense about publishing something, not publishing it, not refusing to publish it, but publishing it at 8 o'clock in an evening. John Swinney was on the radio first thing in the morning the day after that. So perhaps Jackson Carlaw wasn't just in his bed at 8 o'clock on Thursday night. He wasn't up to hear John Swinney on the radio early the next morning. Either John Swinney answered a topical question in this very chamber on Tuesday afternoon, and of course we're standing here in this chamber right now discussing these very issues. The fact that Jackson Carlaw has to talk about all these process issues shows that on the substance he knows he's in the wrong, because Scottish education is improving and we will continue to push forward with these improvements. Jackson Carlaw doesn't like it, but it's in the interest of pupils, the length and breadth of this country.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, last week I raised with the First Minister the crisis in Scotland's GP and primary care services. This week, Scotland's largest health board, Greater Glasgow and Clyde, suspended all out-of-hours GP services at 5 centres due to a shortage of doctors. Is the First Minister willing to accept that she bears any responsibility or any accountability for this?
First Minister.
Well, the fact that I am standing here answering questions shows that I believe, as it is right and proper, that I am accountable and answering questions on these issues. In terms of NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, they have announced temporary changes while they have a significant and sustained recruitment campaign. It has been made clear to the Health Board, and the Health Secretary will continue to make it clear, that they have a responsibility to ensure improvements and to make sure that their out-of-hours services meet the varied needs of their local population. It is important to note that a full home visiting service is maintained across all of Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and in addition, of course, transport is made available to those who require it. So the Health Secretary will continue to work with the Board to ensure that the improvements are made to allow all of these services to operate in the way that patients expect them to do.
Richard Leonard.
First Minister, these are neither changes nor improvements, they are closures. And only last month, the Cabinet Secretary for Health told a national newspaper, and I quote her, "There is a wee plan in place now with Greater Glasgow and Clyde to make that out-of-hours service more robust." This week, 5 out-of-hours services have closed. If this is what happens when the Cabinet Secretary has a wee plan, let's hope she doesn't have any more. Last week, I warned the First Minister that cuts to GP services will hit A&E waiting times. And we know that already. This year, at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Glasgow, 1 in 3 people have waited more than 4 hours in the accident and emergency department. So we've got GP services under threat, out-of-hours GP services closing, and A&E waiting times going up. The government talks of a whole system approach. Is this how the First Minister defines a whole system approach, or is it a whole system failure?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, E&E waiting times are improving, and of course they remain the best in the whole of the UK and significantly better than where Labour is in government in Wales. But coming back to... They don't... Well, you know, as I said last week, at the centre of this proposition from Richard Leonard is that the health service in Scotland would be better if Labour were in government. Well, we have proof that that is not the case, because where they are in government in Wales, the health service is performing significantly worse than it is in Scotland. But come back to the plans around Greater Glasgow and Clyde. Let me talk about the plan that is in place that Richard Leonard clearly thinks is not important. A significant and sustained recruitment campaign for GPs and advanced nurse practitioners, service remodelling to create multidisciplinary teams, a review of GP pay rates will be conducted to ensure they're comparable to other boards, an appropriate appointment system being introduced. These are temporary changes that have been made to allow those improvements to be implemented. In the meantime, home visits are undertaken by GPs, a patient transport service is in place across Glasgow to take patients to out-of-hours services. And of course, lastly, Professor Lewis Ritchie, who led on the national review of out-of-hours services, has agreed to provide support to the board as they improve those services. That's exactly the kind of action we need to see, and the Health Secretary will be holding the board firmly to account on it.
Richard Leonard.
These services are not improving, they are closing. And look, I accept that the First Minister last week may have thought mistakenly that Bolton was in Wales, but surely that she knows that Glasgow is in Scotland. that Inverclyde Royal Hospital is in Scotland, that Easter House is in Scotland, that Gartnavel is in Scotland, that Greenock is in Scotland, and that the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital is in Scotland. The First Minister talks a lot about financial inputs, but what people are concerned about are patient outcomes. And it's not only in accident and emergency where the government is not meeting its commitments and not keeping its promises. This week, it was confirmed that treatment time guarantees are still being missed as well. In fact, missed 82,000 times last year. As many as 1 in 4 people not treated in time. So it's not enough for the First Minister to apologise to patients waiting too long, to families anxious and in distress, to NHS staff under-resourced and undervalued and overstretched. It's time the First Minister recognised her accountability, took some responsibility and started meeting, finally, her own NHS targets.
First Minister.
Well, let me try and take on all of the different issues that were raised by Richard Leonard in that series of questions. Firstly, on treatment time guarantee, the statistics published this week show an improvement in treatment time guarantee performance compared to the last quarter. Our accident and emergency performance improved in the last week as well and remains the best in the whole of the UK. In terms of GPs, I know Labour are very sensitive about their performance in Wales, and so they should be. But in terms of Turbolton, it should be Richard Leonard who is reflecting in what he said last week, where he was inaccurate in what he said about the Health Secretary. And the issue in Turbolton is not one of closure, it's one of a change of location, where the same number of GPs will be serving the same number of patients. That is the reality. We have a number of initiatives underway to make sure we are recruiting more GPs and continuing to deliver excellent health services across the country. And interestingly, neither Richard Leonard or Jackson Carlaw have mentioned today's budget, of course, because they're still trying to work out how they justify voting against it when it delivers everything they asked for. But on the National Health Service, £15 billion of funding, record funding in our National Health Service, supporting record numbers of people working in our National Health Service, and spending in our National Health Service that is higher per head of population than in other parts of the UK. That's the record of this SNP government, and we'll get on and continue delivering the best National Health Service of any country in the United Kingdom.
Thank you. We have a number of constituency questions. The first from Liz Smith, to be followed by Bob Doris. Liz Smith.
Thank you. The First Minister will be well aware of the news earlier in the week, which revealed that the former NHS Tayside surgeon, Professor Sam El-Jamel, is now practising in Libya, and of the very considerable ongoing distress that this is causing to his former patients in Scotland, who've already been waiting for 2 years to find out if there will be a criminal prosecution following the alleged malpractice in Scotland. Now, I know that the First Minister cannot comment on ongoing police inquiries, but can I ask her what her Scottish Government can do to offer Professor El-Jamel's patients in Scotland, who have been so badly traumatised by this, some support?
First Minister.
Well, I share Liz Smith's concern about the report we read earlier in the week. In terms of support for patients of the surgeon, if there is any support the Scottish Government can give, then we are more than happy to consider that. And if there are constituents of Liz Smith who want to be in touch with us, then we'd be happy to make that contact. In terms of the surgeon's ability to practice, of course, I can't comment on ongoing police investigations. However, Liz Smith will also be aware whether or not a surgeon remains able to practice is a matter for the General Medical Council, not for the Scottish Government. It is not something we have power over, but suffice to say, I do understand and share the concerns that have been raised, and certainly want to be in a position to offer whatever support we can to patients affected.
Bob Doris, to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
First Minister, I have been contacted by women who are suffering due to a UK-wide shortage of HRT. Here's what one woman told me just this morning. Stopping medication abruptly can have all kinds of negative effects. Until there's a re-established supply, it feels as though you just have to wait, feeling less than yourself until it becomes resolved. All the issues you're trying to combat, sweats, mood swings, etc., come back. There must be women struggling day to day, possibly in silence, as they feel they cannot turn to their employer. First Minister, I will be writing to Matt Hancock, the UK Secretary of State, outlining the blight caused to women's lives in my constituency that I represent, to ask him what he can do to tackle this shortage. We surely have a common cause across the UK in relation to this matter. How can the Scottish Government assist?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, I know that many women will have very real concerns about shortages of HRT. As Bob Doris rightly says, the implications of that for many women can be and will be severe. Many women will suffer very debilitating symptoms, and as Bob Doris rightly says, many will suffer in silence. It is an unacceptable situation and one that people are rightly concerned about. The supply of medicines, of course, is reserved to the UK Government. We continue to press them to work very closely with the affected companies to resolve the issue as quickly as possible. Last month, the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer for Scotland wrote to all NHS boards, GPs and community pharmacists to advise them about the latest supply position and to provide advice about appropriate HRT products for patients who are affected by the supply issues. Any disruptions in the availability of drugs, including HRT, will be concerning to those who have been prescribed them, and anybody affected by the disruption should discuss alternative treatment options with their doctor in the first instance.
Thank you. Jackie Bailey, to be followed by Mark MacDonald. Jackie Bailey.
NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde announced the complete suspension of out-of-hours services in Inverclyde and the effective closure at sites across Glasgow and in my own constituency at the Vale of Leven Hospital. This most basic of emergency services will no longer operate between 5 p.m. to midnight or at weekends, forcing my constituents to travel for more than 20 miles to get to an A&E service. This will simply add to the waiting times at A&E instead of treating people locally. And can I say to the First Minister, temporary is 18 months to 2 years. The report from Sir Lewis Ritchie was 5 years ago. The Health Board have had years to sort this problem out, but have instead stuck their head in the sand and done nothing. Will the First Minister instruct the Health Board to reverse this decision, agree that the Health Secretary will meet with me and with local campaigners who are devastated by this action, and while she's at it, sack the Chair and Chief Executive of NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde for gross incompetence?
First Minister.
Well, in terms of the Health Board, Jackie Bailey will be aware that it is partly concern about out-of-hours performance that led the Health Secretary to elevate the board to level 4 of the monitoring regime. I'm advised by the Health Secretary she has asked Callum Campbell, who's been appointed by the Scottish Government as its turnaround director, to meet with and speak to Jackie Bailey about the local issues in her constituency, and if that contact hasn't been made yet, it will be made shortly. These are temporary changes. But we want to see the Health Board prioritising improvements to the services at the Vale of Leven and Inverclyde. We do see that as a priority, and we will be working closely with the Board as they take forward the other improvements that they are required to make.
Thank you. Mark MacDonald, to be followed by Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In November 2014, Clydesdale Bank trumpeted investment in and refurbishment of their branch in Dyce in my constituency. Yesterday, they announced the plans to close that branch in September of this year. This follows the closure of the village's RBS and a significant reduction in the opening hours of the village's TSB. Does the First Minister share my concern at the approach being taken, which will be detrimental to my constituents and local businesses? And while this is ultimately a commercial decision, will the Scottish Government do what it can to raise this matter and seek to convince Virgin Money, who own Clydesdale, to think again?
First Minister.
Well, I do understand these concerns. Closures of bank branches cause understandable concerns, particularly in more rural communities, and this is an issue that we discuss regularly with different banks and will continue to do so. I'm sure Fiona Hislop, the New Economy Secretary, would be happy to discuss the issue further with Mark MacDonald and raise it again with banks generally and with Clydesdale Bank in particular.
Thank you. Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, the Accounts Commission is seriously concerned regarding the slow progress of Fife's Integrated Joint Board and anticipates another overspend in excess of £10 million this year. These significant financial pressures are putting health and social care services at risk. What urgent action will the Scottish Government take to ensure clear financial sustainability issues are addressed?
First Minister.
Well, these are issues that are under discussion. I know the Health Secretary's had very recent discussions about this, and indeed part of the local government settlement that involves social care in the budget has at its heart the need to address issues like this in Fife as well as more generally. And I'm sure the Health Secretary would be happy to send a progress and an update report to the member in due course.
Thank you. Question number 3, Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. Can I first welcome the decision to reject the Cool Links development? It seems that some lessons may have been learned since Donald Trump was allowed to trash the many estate. But there remain big questions over Trump's business dealings in Scotland. The purchase of Many and the Turnberry Golf Resort were part of Trump's huge cash spending spree in the midst of a global financial crisis, while his son was bragging about money pouring in from Russia. The US House of Representatives has heard testimony which states, "We saw patterns of buying and selling that we thought were suggestive of money laundering." And the testimony goes on to express particular concern about the golf courses in Scotland and Ireland. Is the First Minister aware that nearly a year ago the campaigning organisation Avaz sent her a briefing setting out these concerns in great detail and proposing action which is within the power of the Scottish Government? They've heard nothing back since last summer. Can the First Minister tell us what action has been taken since this report was received?
First Minister.
No, I can't do that today. I'm happy to go back and look at that correspondence and come back to Patrick Harvey in detail. I think most people here would recognise that I am no defender of Donald Trump, of his politics or any of his other dealings. But where there are concerns, as I think I hear Patrick Harvey say about alleged criminality, these are matters in Scotland for the police and for the Crown Office to investigate. They would not be matters for me to investigate, and I hope members across the chamber would understand and respect the very good reasons for that. But in terms of the specific correspondence, I will certainly check back through my office to see what happened after that was received and what action, if any, was taken, and I'll come back to Patrick Harvey on that as quickly as possible.
Patrick Harvey.
The First Minister is right that criminality in Scotland would be a matter for the law officers and prosecutors, but there are also questions here for Scottish ministers leading the Scottish Government. Under the Criminal Finances Act, it has powers that are designed for just this kind of situation. Trump's known sources of income don't explain where the money came from for these huge cash transactions. There are reasonable grounds for suspecting that his lawfully obtained income was insufficient. Trump is a politically exposed person in terms of the law, and there are reasonable grounds for suspecting that he or people he's connected with have been involved in serious crime. Some of them pleaded guilty. Scottish ministers can apply via the Court of Session for an unexplained wealth order, a tool designed for precisely these kind of situations. We need to be given confidence that the government will show leadership and use the powers available to them. Will the First Minister seek an unexplained wealth order and make it clear that Scotland is not a country where anyone with the money can buy whatever land and property they want, no questions asked?
First Minister.
Well, certainly Scotland is not that kind of country and should never be that kind of country. Look, I say in all seriousness to Patrick Harvey, he is raising serious issues. I don't want to give him answers without the full information in front of me. So I am undertaking to come back to him after I've had the chance to look into this in more detail. Obviously, as I've said, and as Patrick Harvey has accepted, issues of alleged criminality would not be for me to investigate. But beyond that, and I'm not talking about the specifics here because it would be wrong for me to do so without having properly looked at this, but in general terms, where the Scottish Government was taking legal action of any nature, it may also be inappropriate or certainly ill-advised for me to talk about that in this chamber in detail as well. So if any action in any subject is a matter for legal proceedings, then there's a lot of sensitivity and respect for due process that has to be attached to that. But I do take the question seriously. I will look into the correspondence that Patrick Harvey has referred to today, and I will come back to Patrick Harvey as soon as possible with as full an answer as I'm possible to give, with all of the caveats that I hope he understands I've injected into this answer so far today.
Question number 4, Willie Rennie.
2 hours ago, the Court of Appeal ruled against the third runway at Heathrow. I asked the First Minister about her support for Heathrow last May, but she was standing firm. I asked her again this January, and she refused to budge. Is the First Minister glad a court has stopped Heathrow expansion?
First Minister.
I actually think Willie Rennie mischaracterises my answers to him. The decision on whether or not there is a third runway at Heathrow is not one for me or for my government. In fact, I think I pointed out to him that the last time this came to a vote in the House of Commons, SNP MPs did not vote in favour of that. I understand the court has ruled in the way that Willie Rennie says this morning. I've not had the opportunity to look at the reasons behind that ruling, but I want to see all government policies, both Scottish Government policies and Westminster Government policies, aligning with our climate change ambitions, and in Scotland's case, the need to get to a net zero position by 2045. And I think increasingly questions have been, and understandably and rightly are being raised, about whether or not expanding Heathrow in that way would align with that climate change responsibility. So I hope that is clear to Willie Rennie. I'm not sure how I can make my position any clearer. And as far as the court is concerned, these are always matters for the courts.
Rennie.
Well, I'm afraid all that waffle won't tackle climate change. The court found that the UK government had failed to carry out an environmental assessment on its Paris climate change commitments. The Scottish Government made exactly the same mistake when it signed the Memorandum of Understanding on Heathrow. Our parliamentary questions found that no climate change assessment was made by Scottish ministers. They missed 600,000 tonnes of emissions. But the First Minister told us not to worry, as the Tories were taking care of the environmental side of things. That looks pretty stupid today. So will the First Minister confirm that she is finally ripping up her agreement in support of Heathrow expansion?
First Minister.
Well, I don't know how to make this clearer to Willie Rennie, that the decision on Heathrow expansion is not for the Scottish Government. It is not within our power or areas of responsibility. What we did say was that if that was going ahead, and I would hope Willie Rennie would understand this, then any economic benefit of that should not miss out Scotland. And in terms of our climate change ambitions, unlike the UK Government, of course, we include emissions from aviation in the calculation of our emissions overall. And again, I think Willie Rennie should be aware of this, because I'm sure I've pointed it out in the Chamber previously. We are in the process right now, the latter stages of the process of updating our climate change action plan, which will be published in April. So we are looking right across government at all of our policies to make sure. Well, I'm being heckled from Mike Rumbles, who says actions, not words. The climate change action plan is all about actions to meet our world-leading targets, and it's actually what this Parliament demanded we do. So can I suggest Willie Rennie, instead of getting up and calling for things that are out with the powers of this government, actually puts his shoulder to the wheel and looks at the actions this government and this Parliament and this country has to take, because that's exactly what my government is doing.
A lot of constituency questions, if we can get through some of them. Annie Wells to be followed by Anas Sarwar. Annie Wells.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, Anne-Marie Ward of Drug Death Action Group Favour UK said this about yesterday's drug summit. It was nothing more than a party political broadcast for the SNP, and no one in the Scottish Government is willing to take responsibility for what's under their control. As well as being in recovery for decades, Anne-Marie is also a member of your party, First Minister. She's going to another funeral of a friend who died from drugs on Monday, and she's asking why this government keeps blaming Westminster when it has the powers to fund rehab beds now. Will the First Minister put politics aside and back the cross-party calls for £15.4 million to residential rehab?
First Minister.
Well, can I say I will listen carefully to all those with lived experience, including Anne-Marie Ward. I think her views deserve to be treated absolutely seriously, just like the views of anybody. But I do think for Annie Wells to say that about the summit yesterday does all of the people who contributed to that summit a real disservice, because
that summit discussed important issues. It discussed issues important to people with lived experience, and it discussed changes in the law that are required. The task force reported on its recommendations, and there were a range of initiatives and suggestions raised yesterday that hopefully will feed into the UK Government Summit that is being held today. Let me say two other points. On funding, the draft budget that was published a few weeks ago included an increase in funding for reducing harms related to drugs, increased funding of £12.7 million. I can confirm today that the Finance Secretary will confirm this afternoon that we intend to go further than that. Instead of an additional £12.7 million, there will be an additional £20 million of funding from health dedicated to reducing harms from drugs. And that will support the recommendations that the task force brings forward. So we are very, very serious about this, and we are serious in working with anybody and everybody to tackle what is a public health emergency. But on the issue of UK government action, we absolutely recognise the responsibility in us, and the range of actions that we are taking, the funding we are dedicating to this shows that. But it is the case that there was a lot of consensus yesterday that law changes are needed as well, including around a safe consumption room, and that does lie with the UK government. So I absolutely take my responsibility. I just wish we had a similar approach from the UK government so that we could genuinely put party politics aside on this and work together in the interests of those who need us to do exactly that.
Alasdair. He started screaming in my face that I should go home, that I was a terrorist. Again, he used the P word, swearing at me, telling me I wasn't welcome here. The words of Lindsay Taylor, a Scots-born Muslim who wears a hijab. She goes on to say, I don't use public transport, I don't walk about streets I am unaware of. It has altered my behaviour. The initial findings of our public inquiry into Islamophobia will shock the majority of Scots, but sadly not surprise Scottish Muslims. It found a third of Muslims saying Islamophobia is an everyday issue. 80% have experienced Islamophobia, and 80% believe it is getting worse. This impacts education, policing, communities, transport and employability. First Minister, will you commit that all relevant Scottish Government departments will make themselves available to support the work of the inquiry? Because I know there are lots of issues that divide people in this chamber and indeed in our country. But the fight against all forms of prejudice and hatred is one fight that I know that must unite us all.
First Minister.
Yes, I will give that commitment on behalf of the Scottish Government, that the Scottish Government and its agencies will make ourselves available to cooperate with this inquiry. The findings coming out of this inquiry, as Anna Sarwar said, will shock many people, but unfortunately they do not shock Muslims, and I'm sad to say they do not entirely shock me either, because I regularly hear from Muslim friends and constituents of mine the completely unacceptable, heinous abuse that they are the victims of almost on a daily basis. It is unacceptable, it shames our country, and whatever else we may disagree on, whatever else we may divide on, we must unite to stamp this out. That bigotry, racism, prejudice, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, prejudice of any shape or form or nature is completely unacceptable. It is not who we are. We must never tolerate it, and we must come together to make sure that it can be eradicated once and for all.
Thank you. Question number 5, Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the economic impact has been this year of flooding.
Minister.
There's no doubt that the impact of flooding can be significant. When flooding occurs, communities, businesses and infrastructure suffer with the economic impact depending on the location, source, extent and duration of flooding. There are, of course, other significant consequences which, although not economic, are very important, including the stress and anxiety of those affected and, of course, travel disruption. Managing flood risk is a priority for the Government. We invest a minimum of £42 million in flood protection measures each year, as well as supporting SEPA's flood forecasting service and the Scottish Flood Forum. We're also aware of the threat of increased flooding posed by climate change, and that's why we're leading the way in the transition to net zero.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank the First Minister for that reply. Last weekend, the A8 trunk road from Langbank into Inverclyde was closed due to flooding, with reports of people sleeping in their vehicles overnight. And this is in addition to the usual flood areas that actually take place in my constituency. Whilst the constituents may have been able to use a back road to get into Inverclyde, visitors to the area, as well as drivers delivering goods to businesses, will have struggled to reach my constituency at the weekend. Will the First Minister support my calls for improvements to the current roads and flood prevention infrastructure, as well as a feasibility study into a bypass as solutions to improving the economic opportunity, as well as the health needs of my constituency?
First Minister.
Well, the second Strategic Transport Project Review is now well underway, and it is considering improvements to the transport network across Scotland, including, I can say today, the A8 in the member's constituency. The review will appraise a range of potential interventions, including any upgrades to the A8 through Inverclyde, and that will ensure that our transport investment plans remain relevant to delivering the outcomes of the new National Transport Strategy and continue to be the correct decisions for the public purse. The cause of surface water flooding can often be a complex interaction of many sources of flooding, and I understand that Scottish Water and Inverclyde Council are currently working together to consider the best way of tackling flood issues within Inverclyde.
Question number 6, Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government considers to be the educational benefits of learning to play music.
First Minister.
Music education provides significant benefits to children and young people. It gives them opportunities to be creative, and it also contributes greatly to their mental, emotional, social and physical well-being. It's for that reason that the expressive arts, which includes music, is one of the 8 core areas of the curriculum in Scotland. It is for local authorities to decide how to provide music education depending on local circumstances, priorities and traditions. In taking those decisions, local authorities should consider the undoubted benefits that learning a musical instrument can have on well-being and attainment.
Brian Whittle.
Can I thank the First Minister for that answer, but I don't know how you can reconcile your answer with the fact that the Government refuses to class music tuition as core to the curriculum. In council areas who are now charging for music tuition, and that's 26 out of the 32 councils, uptake of music tuition has plummeted by as much as 45%. So like sport and art and drama, access to music tuition is increasingly only available to those who can afford it. First Minister, you never miss an opportunity to declare your desire to tackle inequality, but surely you must recognise that persisting with these types of policies, you are reducing opportunities for our children to participate and excel, and you're actually driving inequality.
I would urge members not to use the term. Urge members not to use the term "you." Just refers to the First Minister by her title. First Minister.
It's more polite than the Tories usually are, but we'll let that one go. An issue of fact, in terms of the broad general education in Scotland, pupils are entitled to music as one of the 8 core parts of the curriculum. Secondly, I have made it clear, the Deputy First Minister has made it clear in the past, that we are concerned by moves by any local authority to limit access to instrumental music tuition. All local authorities should consider the Education Committee's recommendations that music tuition should be provided free of charge. Of course, we have the budget. This afternoon, we're already providing a fair deal for local authorities, but of course, as a result of the deal announced yesterday, there will be an additional £95 million going to local authorities for resource spending, which should make it easier for those local authorities who are struggling to keep music tuition free. Now, I would say that the Conservatives specifically asked us to put £95 million extra into the revenue budgets of local government, so perhaps the question for the Tories today is, given that we have now done so, will they back that budget, or will they vote against the money that is needed for the very things that they stand up in this chamber and demand, including music education?
Willie Coffey.
Thank you. Does the First Minister recognise the positive influence that 2 successful rock bands from Kilmarnock, namely Biffy Clyro and Fatherson, are having on young people in my constituency and elsewhere, opening up for those young people the prospect of successful careers in the world of music, which is well provided for in East Ayrshire?
First Minister.
Well, as an Ayrshire girl, I'm always delighted to celebrate success from Ayrshire, including Kilmarnock, and both of these bands that Willie Coffey references are excellent and inspirational. But I do think they also illustrate the importance of giving young people access to music. That's why I think it's very important. That's why it has the place it does have in the curriculum, and that's why, of course, we're providing the resources to local authorities to make sure that they can provide music tuition to young people free of charge, which I think they should all do.
And Sarah Boyack, question number 7. Sarah Boyack.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the causeless statement that the draft budget proposals put the 2030 child poverty target at risk.
Minister.
Well, firstly, I would say that response came before yesterday's announcement that £95 million extra was going to local government. In addition, this year we will introduce the Scottish Child Payment for eligible under 6s, which around 140,000 families will be eligible for. The budget also commits £843 million for affordable housing, £645 million for the expansion of early learning, £182 million for tackling the poverty-related attainment gap in schools, and £3.4 billion for social security. Local government will receive additional revenue funding of £589.4 million, alongside the ability to raise the council tax. Councils now have the potential to access an additional £724.4 million, which is a real terms increase of 5.3%. So actually, the Scottish budget will help us in our efforts to tackle child poverty, and I hope the member and her party accordingly will back these budget proposals this afternoon.
Sarah Boyack.
If the First Minister had actually looked at the demands for fair funding for our services, she will know that there will be cuts to essential services following this year's budget. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation have also said the budget falls short of the mark in tackling child poverty. The Poverty Alliance has also called for increased investment in the Scottish Welfare Fund because crisis grants are a vital lifeline for families. I know this is difficult for SNP members. Crisis grants are a vital lifeline for families who are struggling to get by, but councils need proper funding to cope with the increased demand that COSLA made representations to the government about. First Minister, will you listen not just to us, but to other organisations in order to wipe out child poverty across Scotland and to give our young people a chance for the future?
First Minister.
Well, of course, a bit like the Tories, Labour asked us to put additional money into local government. We have said we are putting additional money into local government. It was the amount that they seemed to want us to do, but of course now they're trying to justify voting against it. But I don't think anybody who cares about tackling poverty and tackling child poverty in particular could in good conscience vote against this budget this afternoon, because it includes the funding for the Scottish Child Payment, which will in the first phase of it deliver extra income to 140,000 families, something that Richard Leonard used to ask me to do but hasn't mentioned since we agreed to do it, strangely enough. It includes more money for affordable housing, more money for early learning and childcare, money for tackling the poverty-related attainment gap in schools, and real terms increase in the funding available to local government. If Labour vote against this budget this afternoon, they put all of that at risk, including much of what we will be investing in social security, and it will be them in these circumstances that will have to explain why they are prepared to put the fight against child poverty at risk. I'm sure they don't want to be in that difficult position.
Thank you very much, and we'll return to that subject later. That concludes... Oh, point of order. Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On an earlier answer to Richard Leonard, the First Minister stated that to Bolton GP surgery is not closing, it's just moving. It's actually moving to Moss Blown, the Presiding Officer, which is definitely not into Bolton. So that is an inaccuracy. The GP surgery into Bolton is closing, and I would like to have that on the record, please.
Thank you. I note the point that Mr Whittle makes. It is a point of clarification rather than a point of order for me to adjudicate on, but that point has been made. And that will conclude First Minister's questions. We're going to move shortly to members' business.
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.